Welcome to the Unlist. Today we're having a bit more of a fun episode. It's I Bet You Didn't Know. And it's an episode where I just give you some random factoids that I bet you didn't know about perfume. Basically a trivia episode, not about any one specific thing, nothing in particular, just random things that I think don't really get talked about in videos, either on my channel or really anyone else's. Just random tidbits of information that you might find amusing or interesting or could perhaps spur you on to your next rabbit hole, your next adventure. So, let's start off with a really big one that a lot of people don't realize. And that is, I bet you didn't know a lot of vintage perfumery consists of pre-made accords and bases, compounds that are actually pre-made before the perfumer actually mixes anything together. Yes, pre-made bases and accords. Basically the perfume equivalent of a Kool-Aid packet or instant rice or something like butters and herb noodles, like something that's basically you just add water to it or put it in something and boom, it exists. And these pre-made bases still exist to an extent in modern perfumery. There are still both historically significant bases that see limited use, but there are other compounds that are multiple materials mixed together into a sort of amalgam compound that then covers a theme, a smell, a type. But we rely a lot less on those now with all of the modern chemistry that we have, all of the different patent molecules that can only be accessed through contracts to individual perfume houses, oil houses. But a long time ago, before those oil houses really controlled that supply in quite the same way, we had basically chemical suppliers who made chemicals for food, drug, scent, everything. And a lot of them would have pre-made perfume bases or pre-made compounds that could cover like a floral smell or a woody smell or something. And they were both convenient for perfumers to use back then. And I'm going back to like the 1910s, 1920s, or the late 1800s. But no one exactly knew what was in those bases because obviously the specific material composition of those bases was kept secret. But one of the most famous ones that a lot of my vintage collecting friends will know is Mousse de Saxe. Very famous pre-made base. Mousse de Saxe came from Delaire, and it was more or less a incredibly important material for anyone looking to create like an oak moss accord or build a chypre accord of some kind. You didn't see Mousse de Saxe as much in fougères really, but a lot of chypre fragrances, a lot of leather fragrances used Mousse de Saxe, and Mousse de Saxe was so important that when Delaire finally stopped making it, a lot of perfumers scrambled to try and substitute it with something because they didn't exactly know what was in it, but they needed it to continue making some of their best-selling fragrances that were still selling well when Delaire decided to stop making it. So, and that leads me to the second thing, is that perfume houses that relied very heavily on these pre-made bases and pre-made compounds found themselves in a world of trouble when either those compounds were discontinued or the companies that produced them went under. Of particular note, the House of Caron. Those of you, again, into vintage fragrances, you've heard of Parfums Caron, and Ernest Daltroff was the original founding perfumer of that house. And he was a self-educated, self-trained perfumer. So you could say he was kind of like an artisanal perfumer would be now, an independent perfumer. Didn't go to school, didn't really study, just kind of learned it on his own because he was interested in doing it. And he actually didn't start making perfume until relatively later in life. He was already middle-aged when he began playing with perfumes, and Parfums Caron was a result of his experimentation and works. So one of the things that separated him from contemporaries like Francois Coty or Jacques Guerlain is that he relied very heavily on many pre-made compounds and bases. A lot of Caron perfumes were heavily based on these pre-made compounds. And when he passed away and the house changed ownership to Felice, I'm probably going to say her name wrong, but Vanapuya, but his muse basically, not his wife, but his muse took over the house and business partner. And then, well, all the best intentions aside, a lot of those pre-made bases went away, and suddenly a lot of classic Carons could literally no longer be made. And just no one stopped to really think what was in those bases, and they didn't have gas chromatography back then either. So yeah, it became a situation where the perfumers had to kind of smell the fragrance and go, okay, I think this is in it, and do all this like process of elimination and trial and error until they got it close enough. And that right there is the reason why so many vintage collectors prize the really early Caron fragrances, and why the later reformulations, you know, whether we're talking about the stuff that was done in the 80s with Richard Fraisse and 90s Kiko Kamei, or maybe the earlier reformulations in the 50s. But the 50s stuff tends to hold up, 60s as well, but more recent reformulations, maybe within the last 30, 40 years, so like I said, starting with the 80s forward, you see a lot of Caron enthusiasts really just have mixed opinions. Very, very mixed opinions, you know, about the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s Caron fragrances. All the classics like Nuit de Noël and Narcisse Noir and, you know, stuff like that. All those really old ones. Tabac Blanc would be another one. And they say that unlike Guerlain, which Guerlain made their own compounds, Guerlain had their own Guerlainade, right? Guerlain had a lot of their own materials, so they could control the reformulation process a lot more because they were using all their own in-house stuff. Caron relied very heavily on these prefabricated bases made by other suppliers, so that became a big boondoggle when it came time to reformulate, and they no longer had access to those. So there you go. Like I said, some pre-made bases still exist now, but these days, more often than not, you're going to get patented individual molecules rather than compound bases. You get the captives, what they call the captives, and those are individual molecules designed by whatever oil house. So they still, like I said, they still have some mixed things that they sell, but these big pre-built multi-material bases, not as popular now. So just not as popular, but they still exist. One that's very well known would be Tonkatone. Tonkatone is very well known. It's a compound musk that recreates the smell of Tonkin musk artificially using several synthetic musks. Another one would be Animalis, which is a historic base that's gone through changes over the years, but still exists. And there are others, but something that, bet you didn't know. Now, another thing, bet you didn't know, is that a lot of houses that do everything through third party, right? Like houses that use IFF, Firmenich, Givaudan. A lot of times when they switch from one contract over to the other, like they go from one supplier to another, they can't have the formula. So they have to literally clone their own fragrance. Everybody wants to talk about how bad clones are. Clones are bad. Oh, clones are terrible. I've seen lots of videos decrying clones, but it's a very common thing with the perfume industry to self-clone. And the reason why they have to self-clone is every time they switch supplier, distributor, the people who control the formula, they can't access that formula anymore. So let me give you a very good example of that. Okay. Through my perfume collection right here. Where is the bottle? So, this fragrance, Dolce & Gabbana Pour Homme, has infamously gone through several reformulations. This is obviously a newer bottle. This is not one of the made in Italy bottles, but the big reason why this had so many notable and noticeable changes in reformulation over the years, why it has had a tumultuous history, is that the original supplier of this fragrance was Italia. Italia is who Dolce & Gabbana went through when they originally decided to commission that fragrance being made. The original Dolce & Gabbana fragrance, the women's one, and then this later men's one, which came out in 1994. Perfumers Max Gavari, and it was Italia. So, thing is, Max Gavari was a perfumer who worked for IFF, okay? And so, looking through here, he was a perfumer for IFF, or is. I'm not sure if he's still alive or not. He might still be alive, but Max Gavari, IFF perfumer. Italia was the distributor. So, as you know, distributors and or cosmetics brands like L'Oreal will have different oil houses on retainer. They'll have what they call short lists. These short lists consist of suppliers that they have contracts with, they prefer to use. So in this case, Italia's short list of suppliers included IFF. Now, when the original version of this was released in '94, Max Gavari fragrance, IFF supplied all the materials, Italia did the distribution, manufacture and distribution. Dolce & Gabbana later left. Okay, so they left Italia and they went to Procter & Gamble, Prestige Beauty, or Beauté. Okay, Procter & Gamble is another big company. Procter & Gamble, mainly known for things like toothpaste, dish soap, shampoo, stuff like that. They decided to try and get into fine fragrance, so they had a prestige beauty division. And let's just say things didn't go the way they were intended to, because a company that had no prior experience in how to contract suppliers and make fine fragrances is suddenly now in charge of manufacturing and distributing these pre-existing fragrances. And obviously, Procter & Gamble had no association with IFF, right? So they couldn't just go to IFF and say, hey, we own the license now for Dolce & Gabbana. We want to make the perfume. IFF's like, no. We made this formula for Euroitalia, so Euroitalia has the rights to this formula. We don't care whose name is on the bottle. It's Dolce & Gabbana. Dolce & Gabbana was the client. Okay? Dolce & Gabbana was the client, but the actual company that paid us to produce this fragrance was Euroitalia. Dolce & Gabbana was their client, not ours. So, okay, Procter & Gamble's like, all right, Euroitalia, can we buy the rights to the formula from you so we can keep manufacturing Dolce & Gabbana Pour Homme? And Euroitalia is like, no, we have no financial incentive to let a competitor who we lost a contract to, mind you. We have no financial incentive to let someone that we lost our contract to have our formula. So kindly piss the fuck off, right? So that left Dolce & Gabbana, well, okay, we need more bottles of our Dolce & Gabbana Pour Homme fragrance. You're our new supplier. What are you going to do? And Procter & Gamble's like, well, we don't know the formula of this fragrance. The supplier of the formula won't give it to us because they were under contract with, this distributor who you're no longer using. We went to the distributor who has the rights to the formula because they're the ones that commissioned it, and they said no. So the owner wouldn't give us the formula, being IFF. The rights holder of the formula, who had it made, won't sell us the rights to the formula. All we can do now is take this fragrance and put it under gas chromatography and basically clone it. And that's what they did. That's what they did. They cloned it. And they had to drum up their own suppliers and their own materials and everything. And I don't know what oil house was in charge of doing the cloning, but it wasn't IFF. I'll tell you that much. IFF didn't do it. So, yeah, that version of Dolce & Gabbana is not very popular because it doesn't resemble that closely the original one. Now, in later years, Procter & Gamble would get out of the fine fragrance game. They would get out of it, and when that happened, obviously someone else would pick up the ball. That ended up being Shiseido, the Japanese company. So Shiseido would get the license for the Dolce & Gabbana fragrances, and guess what? Shiseido does have IFF on their short list. I mean, they also have Takasago as well because Japan, but they have Takasago and they have IFF. So that meant even though they still didn't have rights to the formula because Euroitalia, even now in 2025, Euroitalia still owns the rights to that original Dolce & Gabbana formula. But because they had contact with the supplier, IFF, they could get a closer approximation of the formula because IFF made the original formula, and although they're contractually forbidden to make that formula for a new client, a new distributor, they can at least look at their work and go, okay, well, we can make one that's very close to this because we did the original work and we have most of this stuff here. It's going to be a little different for legal reasons, but we can basically use a mod from the original brief and change it and do whatever and get yourself closer. And that's why the newer fragrance that's out now that has a different cap than this, has the over cap. People seem to like that one more. It's still in this bottle like this, but now, even though this is the Procter & Gamble bottle, I still like it. I've got the Deep Vintage too, but I wanted to show you this one because this is the one that the discussion's about. So it's a little sharper, not as smooth, not as much of the leather accord. It's in the original, not as plush, but it's still a nice fragrance. You know, if you take it on its own merits, it's a nice fragrance. But, you know. So yeah, bet you didn't know that. Another very famous example, very, very famous example of self-cloning is Dior. And I've told this story a lot, so I'm not going to tell it in detail here. You guys already know, I've already gone over this, but the whole reason why there was a black stem and silver stem Dior Homme is that when LVMH decided to take all of Dior's perfumes in-house and develop all their stuff on their own, that meant all of their legacy fragrances, all of their past fragrances, which were contracted out to different oil houses like IFF, like Givaudan, like Firmenich, they no longer had access to those formulas. Because, again, those oil houses that own those formulas, like the original Eau Sauvage was Art et Parfum, Edmund Vernitska's lab. So Edmund Vernitska's lab, which is now run by his son Michael, they're not going to give Dior the original formula for Eau Sauvage, are they? No, they're not. So that meant Francois Demystifying, who was appointed head perfumer, had to basically take extant examples of all the perfumes and put them under chromatography and just basically clone everything. Poison, Fahrenheit, all of them. Had to clone them all. That way they could own the formulas in-house. So yeah, bet you didn't know that. Whether it helps you enjoy the fragrances more or not, I can't really say. But it's just neat stuff to know. It's just fun stuff to know. Another thing that's really interesting for you guys to know that you didn't know that I bet you didn't know. Bet you didn't know that IFRA regulations and restrictions are not law. They're not law. So in countries that have different regulatory bodies and different regulations to follow, the manufacturer is making a fragrance that they choose to only sell in that country or other countries that have similar regulations. They don't have to follow IFRA. They only have to follow the actual regulations of that country. So, the reason why IFRA tends to be perceived as law really just comes down to where most fine fragrances come from. Most fine fragrances that are made in France, made in Italy, they adhere to IFRA regulations because IFRA, which is international, fragrance, it's a self-governing industry body. They tend to make themselves beholden to European legislation. So there is a body within the European Union or EU called the SCCS, and it is basically a scientific cosmetics regulation body. So it's a body that determines what is elite, what is able to go into any cosmetics, not just perfume, but makeup, shampoo, soaps, all that stuff. And the SCCS is actually who determines more or less what IFRA restricts and what the IFRA bans. IFRA fights back and forth with the SCCS because the SCCS is more draconian and more strict. So when IFRA passes new restrictions and IFRA passes new bannings, it is only after fighting against much stricter ones. So the things that get proposed by the SCCS are much stricter than what IFRA eventually passes. So they find a compromise. So, but because most fragrances, no matter where they are sold in the world, you know, whether it's sold in Africa, South America, North America, Australia, China, if they're coming from France, coming from Italy, coming from Germany, they're beholden to that SCCS group. And IFRA, being that self-policing body that is constituent-wise comprised mostly of European brands, right? Firmenich, Givaudan, again, the oil houses, and then other manufacturers too, that ends up being global law de facto. So it's basically European legislation bodies through the IFRA organization, which is kowtowing to them, making the restrictions and bannings apply globally only because the perfume is made there, made in that country. And it is just cheaper and more efficient for them to make all the fragrances in one place and then distribute them all over the planet. But if you're a manufacturer in the United States, manufacturer in Africa, China, Japan, and you're perfectly happy with only selling your fragrances in that country, Avon is a good example of this. Avon has local manufacturing for most of their fragrances all over the world. So a lot of their fragrances follow IFRA, but some of them historically didn't because they were made in Mexico, in Canada, in the United States, just for those markets, for nowhere else. They had very decentralized, very localized manufacturing. So that meant you could buy brand new Avon perfumes made in Mexico that only listed 3 ingredients: water, perfume, color, whatever, that's it. Alcohol. Short list ingredients. Brand new perfume. That has recently changed in the US because the US has some updated regulations with the FDA. Still, the FDA is way more lax than SCCS is, obviously, in Europe. We don't have a separate body for cosmetics. FDA is food and drug. It covers everything. So, but that's just another thing that I bet you didn't know, is that some of your local brands, things that are made in a country, in a market that's not beholden to the more strict regulations of Europe, you know, again, made for Africa, made for Asia, made for North and South America, those may not be IFRA compliant fragrances, and they can't be sold in Europe. They can't be imported into Europe. They would not be allowed. So, might catch a break that way. Well, I know a lot of independent perfumers don't necessarily follow IFRA either. Some do, some don't. So, but I bet you didn't know that. And one final thing. I'm going to wrap this up, actually. One final thing. I bet you didn't know that concentrations are just suggestion. The same way that gender, for him, for her, is marketing suggestion. When a fragrance is called eau de parfum, parfum de toilette, okay, eau de toilette concentré, those are all relatively the same thing. When a fragrance is called extrait de parfum or called parfum, these days the word elixir gets thrown around. What really matters is the percentage of alcohol. So you've got to do reverse math, and when you get a bottle of perfume, if it says 82% alcohol by volume, and another one says 86% alcohol by volume. Guess which one has more scent compounds in it? The one that says 82% alcohol. So that's how you know how much scent compounds you have. If you really care about the concentration, that's how you have to do it, because you have fragrances like Caron Pour Un Homme, Parfum, that have only 1 or 2 points higher in oil than the eau de toilette does. So is it really an eau de parfum then? So when they say things like eau de toilette is 13%, eau de parfum is 15, or something like that, or up to 18, and then parfum is 20, and extrait is 25, 30, that's all suggestion. That's all very much suggestion. Because when you look at something, that's supposed to be a parfum, like for example, like this is supposed to be a parfum. This is Elixir, this is Explorer Extreme. It's supposed to be parfum concentration. But you look at it, and you see that the alcohol volume is 78%. So you do that math, and that means this is what? 22% perfume compounds. So 22% perfume compounds is around parfum strength. So in this case, this is actually legitimately a parfum. But I've seen parfums that were at 18 or 19, So there again. Sometimes the word parfum or eau de parfum or like elixir, right? They are literally just marketing. They're suggestions. It's an impression. This is going to be a richer fragrance. So we're calling it a parfum. Might actually just be an eau de toilette. It might be 13%, right? Who knows? So you can't really hold fast to that stuff. I bet you didn't know that, So a lot of people who say this older version of a fragrance is stronger than a newer one, but the newer one has higher oil compound percentage. Technically the newer one's stronger, it's just the older one smells stronger because the materials in the old one themselves are higher yield, more impactful, more potent, even if it has less oil in it, right? So again, more oil doesn't necessarily make a stronger fragrance, but if you care about concentration, it's more concentrated. Okay, thanks for watching.